Okay, so this tutorial's on the 50% rule of poker. So it's quite an important rule to know, and it's really only ever been discussed in Zenith Poker, mainly because I created the rule, and it's not well known outside of Zenith. But we'll talk about it now, and then hopefully you guys can use it to win some EV. All right, so the learning outcomes for today. So first we're going to have to explain what is meant by the 50% rule, and then provide some examples of where the 50% rule will apply and also where it won't apply. And then we're going to talk about using the 50% rule to construct proper ranges. Okay, so this is the 50% rule written down. Basically, in no-limit games, in heads-up pots, on any street, the out-of-position player should attempt to construct their strategy in such a way as the in-position player can only bet or raise at most 50% of the time. Okay, so the out-of-position player has a strategy that tries to make the in-position player bet or raise at most 50% of the time. All right, so 50% rule. It's also known as Pinnock's razor because I made it, and it's a razor because it allows for quick analysis of many different spots, right? It quickly cuts down on the amount of thought that you need when analyzing certain hands, right? Certain situations. And the reason why this is because it allows for the proper range construction in some spots that are very difficult for humans to understand as a baseline. So, for example, when your opponent bets very large on previous streets and then gives up with the opposition player, it's difficult for you to understand what to do with parts of your range. And so the 50% rule helps enlighten you on what you should be doing. And it applies strongly to the analysis of equilibrium. If you're trying to exploit people, then it also helps to know the 50% rule, because the 50% rule will allow you to see where your opponents are deviating from equilibrium. Any questions so far?
No.
Great. So the 50% rule, it applies most strongly to river situations where the stack is larger than the pot. And this is important. When the stack is less than the pot, the 50% rule won't apply. But the majority of the times that you're playing, when you get to the river, the stack is going to be bigger than the pot. And so the 50% rule will apply, and applies very strongly on the river. There's only a few different spots where when the stack is bigger than the pot, the 50% rule won't apply. And that's in spots where there's like a chop on the board, and things get a little bit weird there. But other than that, the vast majority of situations where you're on the river and the stack is larger than the pot, which is going to be most river situations, the 50% rule will apply. So it's a very important rule to know because it applies a lot of the time in a lot of hands that you'll be playing. And it applies a little bit weakly to pre-flop, flop, and on the turn. As you get closer to the river, the more strongly it will apply, but there are a few situations where on the flop and the turn, and more difficult to find pre-flop, where it doesn't apply. And it applies to all different types of pots where the stack is larger than the pot. Any questions about
that? Thomas, a lot of this has really nothing to do with, who is the aggressor on the last street. It's almost like each street is kind of viewed in isolation, street by street. So if you were like the pre-flop raiser and the flop comes down, doesn't necessarily mean you have to continuation bet. 50% rule says, check with the right kind of range in order to discourage your opponent from betting more than 50% of the time.
Yep, sort of. Definitely, there are some cases, right, and we'll have a look at some of them, where the 50% rule applies, but the in-position player will bet more than half the time. Right, and then in those spots, the out-of-position player has to construct their ranges so the in-position player can't bet, or it can't bet as much as they want. And so the out-of-position player, how they do that is they check everything. Right, but on the other hand, if the out-of-position player is the aggressor, then from the previous street, then often the 50% rule will apply to the out-of-position player's checking range.
Mm-hmm.
So some consequences of the 50% rule. So the out-of-position player should make sure that the checking range is strong enough so that the in-position player has to check back at least 50% of the time. So they're going to try and make a reasonably strong checking range, whether that's a checking range filled with a lot of bluff catchers and then a few very strong hands that will try to check raise, or just a bunch of strong hands, so the in-position player can't bet into them. But often when the out-of-position player, this is the next consequence, when the out-of-position player doesn't have enough strong hands, then the out-of-position player will check their entire range at equilibrium, because if they don't have enough strong hands to protect their checking range, the in-position player will bet more than half the time. And the way that the out-of-position player wins the most EV with their strong hands is to check raise, because check raising will be a very successful play for them, because the in-position player is betting so frequently. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Any questions about
How much is enough?
that? So just enough so the in-position player can't bet more than half the time. All right. Often the out-of-position player just won't have very many strong hands. Say, for example, from pre-flop going to the flop, and the in-position player is the pre-flop aggressor. Then the out-of-position player will have raised all their strong hands on the previous street pre-flop, and so they don't have enough strong hands on the flop now, on this particular flop, to prevent the in-position player from betting everything.
Okay.
Sorry, not betting everything, from betting more than half the time. So the in-position player might only have a betting range around 60% and a checking range of 40%, but that would still mean the out-of-position player should check their entire range.
Does it matter if the in-position player doesn't have too many hands either?
Well, it's enough strong hands, so it depends on the dynamics between the two ranges. If the in-position player doesn't have any strong hands, then the out-of-position player relatively has more strong hands, right? Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah.
So if both players' ranges are just very, very weak, then it's sort of the game of who's got the weaker range, who's got the stronger range, who's got some stronger hands in their range, who's got weak hands in their range. And it could be the case where out-of-position very rarely has the nuts, and in-position never has the nuts. Because out-of-position has it so rarely, the in-position player doesn't care. They're going to bet into that anyway.
I see.
We'll have a look at some more concrete examples soon. So here, this is another consequence. So if the out-of-position player has a betting range, right? So if the out-of-position player has concluded that their range is strong enough to have some bets, and when out-of-position chooses to check instead, the checking range is protected, and so the in-position player, when we're the in-position player, we should try to check back more than half of the range. Right? Does that roughly make sense to everybody? If you're in position and out of position checks in a spot where they can have a betting range, we should check back more than half the time.
Yeah.
Right. So let's have a look at some spots. So have a look at some in position. Some big blind versus button single raise pots. So this is a new set of sims which you guys probably haven't seen before. It's a miscellaneous overbet pots. But let's have a look at Ace King 7, right? Yeah, so here Ace King 7. Right, even on Ace King 7, right, a flop that seems, or even Ace King 9, both these flops seem very good for the in-position player because they have all the Ace King. Right, here on the Ace King 7 rainbow, the in-position player is still checking about half the time. Right, and using sort of very large bets instead. Let's have a quick different example. So on these connected boards, so this is again button versus big blind. On these connected boards, often the out of position player will have quite a few good hands in their range. Okay, and so the out of position player will have a betting range, and so when they have a betting range, the in position player checks back more than half the time. All right, so there's a betting range here for the out of position player, and the in position player checks back more than half the time.
Now that particular board, Thomas, I can clearly understand why the 50% rule applies, but that Ace King 9 board kind of lost me a bit because in position had so much equity.
Ace King 7, Ace King 9,
or Ace King 7, yeah.
Ace King 9. It's the same sort of thing that applies, right? There's just the in-position player has a lot of very strong hands, and so they're going to be betting more than half the time, and so the out-of-position player checks everything. In this specific sim, I haven't allowed the out-of-position player to have a betting range, so that's probably not a good example. Let's have a look at some small blind versus big blind situations. So this is small blind versus big blind. So let's say on the Jack 7-2. So this is what the betting range looks like for the small blind. And when the small blind checks, the big blind is checking back more than half the time. All right.
Mm-hmm.
Even for boards that you think are relatively good for the small blind, when they checking back more than half the time. But if the board is very good for the in-position player, then the out-of-position player will check everything. Right? So we're in Jack 6-5.
Right.
There's a betting range of around 60% of the time, so it makes sense for the out-of-position player to check everything. So if you're looking at flop sims and turn sims, it's often okay for you to remove the donking line if you're confident that the in-position player will bet more than half of the time.
Right.
That's at equilibrium. Exploitatively, it's a different story. Okay, so let's have a look at just a 3-bet pot maybe. So here we can have a look at this 3-bet pot. This is from George. This is from your sims. So this is a 6-man, so 7-6-4.
Mm-hmm.
Betting quite infrequently. And here, this is one of the spots where it doesn't necessarily apply because the in-position player is betting a smaller size than the out-of-position player. But you can still see that despite it, the out-of-position player is checking at a high frequency in order to prevent the in-position player from betting everything.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So this is one of the spots where it doesn't apply. There are a few spots on that doesn't apply on the flop. So that was one of them. And it is pretty common where if the out-of-position player, if their sort of preferred bet size is large compared to the in-position player, then the 50% rule won't necessarily apply on the flop or the turn, but it still will apply on the river, mainly because the in-position player usually wants a bit bigger than the out-of-position player. See if I can look at another counter example for the flop. So we can look at these paired boards. So here we can look at some counter examples. So here we've got some donking for both players. So for example, on 996, here the out-of-position player has the option to bet or check, but they choose to check everything because the in-position player is betting so often. So the out-of-position player, with even their strongest hands, like the quads, right, or the S9 or the full houses, they're still checking them because the in-position player will bet into them, and so you get more EV by going for a check raise rather than betting and then having the in-position player fold. Or say bet half pot, the in-position player will still fold correctly, but if you had checked instead, the in-position player will put money in for you, and so that's why the out-of-position player wants to check even the very strongest hands. So here's a counter example. 776. The out-of-position player bets half the pot, but the in-position player's preferred bet size is only a quarter of the pot. Because of that slight difference, the 50% rule doesn't necessarily apply on this flop. But it is the main idea behind it sort of still applies. The out-of-position player isn't betting everything. The checking range is still quite strong, and the in-position player can't bet too often. There is also probably something to be said about the different sizes on this flop. Maybe if there were infinitely many sizes, it would be much closer to the 50% rule. But obviously, I don't have a computer that's strong enough for that. 554, same sort of idea. 833. Right. Checking everything because it's getting bet into quite often. All right, so those are some flop examples. I guess we can use this one for a turn example as well. So 833. We can probably find a different one. So let's look at some of these overbet flops. 10-5-4. So say, for example, right, we look at, so do you guys have enough of an idea about why it applies on the flop and how it applies on the flop? Or do you guys want some more examples of it?
Yeah, I think I see how it applies on the flop. I mean, one thing that's jumping out at me is that there's quite a few boards you come across where the out of position player has a lead out range when you're going through some of those paired flops, like if the pairs are, 2 8s or 2 9s or two of those middling, like 2 7s. There seemed to be a fairly...
Yeah, that one was the 2 7s, and there's some connected boards. To be totally honest, the way that those boards come across is mainly got to do with the preflop ranges, right? So it depends on the preflop ranges who has the advantage on most flops. Often that'll be the in-position player when you've raised a pretty small preflop from the button here because of the presence of the small blind. But when the small blind folds, the big blind gets pretty amazing pot odds to continue, even though the button's range is quite a bit stronger. Also, the big blind's going to 3-bet some of their strongest hands pre-flop, and so that's 2 reasons why the button will have quite a range advantage on the vast majority of flops. But outside of that idea from pre-flop, there isn't too much difference between the big blind versus button spots and say these small blind versus big blind spots. right, after they've checked.
Right.
The idea is that here in the small blind, we're constructing the checking range such that the imposition player can't bet more than half the time. So there is some very strong hands in here. So there's still some sets. There's a bunch of 2 pairs. There's some over pairs. And then when we're faced with a bet, some of those hands will raise. So these over pairs will check raise. Queen 7-3. Same kind of idea. So we can have a look at this Queen 7-3. So it's gone Queen 7-3, check, 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 check on the river. So it's checked down to the river with this Queen 7-3 in the small blind versus big blind in a single raise pot. So the small blind opened at 3 big blinds, the big blind called. The flop was Queen 7-3 rainbow. Check, check, 6, bring the backdoor flush draw, and then check, check, 6, bringing it's just a brick. So after it goes check, check, we can look at the out of position player's range and how they've played it. So they've checked, and now the in position player has checked, and now the out of position player has to construct their checking range. So it's difficult to see here, but we can see on average that the out of position player is checking 71% of the time. And so that's trying to construct a checking range that makes it difficult for the in position player to bet into it. Right, so the in position player is only betting into it around 40%. Right, so that means that the 50% rule here applies. The out of position player is constructing a relatively strong checking range, and the in position player respects the strength of that checking range by checking back. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So say it goes check, check, and then on the river, the same sort of thing applies. The out of position player has a betting range. Here there's a variety of different bet sizes, all the way from quarter of the pot to 4 times the pot. But when the out of position player checks, the in position player checks back more than half the time. So with the 50% rule, we can see that lines which check down to the river are actually pretty common, right? After this 36% checking frequency on the flop, right, we know that we're going to get to the river pretty often, right, because of the way that our position player has to construct their checking range. Often they're going to be checking after they check the flop because they want their checking range to be relatively strong, right? So here the in position player has checked half the time, and now they're checking half the time again, right? So essentially, if you're out of position on the flop, you can, in some ways, guarantee showdown 1/2 of 1/2 of 1/2 of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So what's that? 1/8 of the time. So 1 1/8 of the time, if you check out of position in sort of this small one versus big one flops, if you've constructed your range correctly, you can get to showdown 1/8 of the time. Right? And then that sort of explains the EV of some of these hands, right? Where the EV comes from. Right, in hands it just doesn't make too much sense for them to have very high EV. They have some EV because of that idea that you can get to showdown.
What happens if the in position player bets more than half the time when they shouldn't be?
So when they shouldn't be, so that means that there is a way to exploit them. So here, for example, after it goes check, check, or wherever, so check, check, and the 71% checking range, and the remainder is bet. If you knew that your opponent, so we're talking about exploits now, if you knew that your opponent was going to bet more than half the time, right, when you check, then you should instead move a lot of your strong hands into the checking range with the intention of check raising, right? Because your check raise is going to be very successful, right? It's going to happen quite often because your opponent is betting for you. Your opponent is reopening the betting, right? So if you're the out of position player and you have a very strong hand and you know that your opponent will bet into you at a high frequency when you check, you should check. Because your opponent is one, reopening the betting so you can raise, and secondly, putting money in the pot for you, right? And they're doing it at a high enough frequency, right? More than you betting yourself and hoping your opponent calls, right? Because your opponent's going to fold some of the time. Does that explain it, or should I explain it in a different way?
So they're not respecting your strong enough checking range, and they bet to you too often. So when you check raise, they don't have many things they can call anymore.
Yeah, there's that, and also your strong hands should check as well. So like if they're betting into you a lot, you should be checking. Right, if they're betting into you a lot with a range that's not strong enough, then you should be checking a lot and then check raising a lot. So with both strong hands as well as whatever bluffs that you wanted to use. But it's not necessarily that you would get more EV check raising as a bluff. In fact, because your opponent is betting so often, some of these weak hands here, so say some of these flush draws, if your opponent is betting very often when you check, then you're not drawing as effectively with a flush draw, right? So with these drawing hands, you're not drawing as effectively because your opponent is betting so often, and so you should actually bet them. So the EV of betting is going to be higher than the EV of checking in that situation. So it's sort of when your opponent is betting too much into you when you check, you should bet all your weak hands and check all your strong hands.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so
Hey Thomas, I got a question. As you're going through these explanations, about building the checking frequency, like right now checking at 71% on the turn. I'm looking at the EV line where it says, kind of towards the bottom where it says the EV is 2.61, and then you got the different betting EVs, and you got a checking EV of 2.3.
Yep.
And the pot is 6. Is there a way of kind of interpreting this 50% rule by looking at this EV line? So okay, we got a checking EV at 2.3, which means that when we check our range.
So these numbers here just mean what is the average EV of all the hands that check? Okay,
Right.
So obviously when you check, you're going to have weaker hands than if you had bet.
True.
And so your checking EV is going to be lower than any of your betting EV.
Yeah, but doesn't that have repercussion on how in position, how often they're going to bet? Because I mean, you got 2.3 checking EV, but so that means you still have you have strong hands in your checking range.
Yes.
I'm just wondering if that's sort of a piece of the puzzle that sort of helps shed some light on this 50% rule, or is that
not particularly. So let's say here we look, it goes check, and then they bet half pot, and then we raise, and then the 6 comes, and now we can see the EV differences between them, right? So the EV of checking is very, very low.
Mm-hmm.
Right, mainly because most of the time when we check here, we're giving up.
Right. Okay.
All right, so there are a few relatively strong hands. So there's a full house there in checking range. There's a couple of straights and stuff. And that is what makes up most of the EV in the checking range, right? It's some of the very strong hands, but all the hands at the bottom have very low EV. So here, there's just a bunch of zeros, right, and some very small ones. So yeah, so the 50% rule. So here's probably a good example. So the 50% rule can help us figure out what we're doing, even in lines which are just uncomfortable. So here the turn goes check. Say we're the in-position player, we bet, and then we get raised, a pot-sized raise, and we call, and the river is a 6. When our opponent checks, the 50% rule tells us that we should be betting roughly 50% of the time. So here's 59% of the time, but maybe if it wasn't a 6, maybe if it was like a 10 or something. 58, 4, 56. So you see we're not betting more than half the time, right, when they check. And that's going to be a common theme, right, on the river. Your 50% rule is going to hold pretty strongly in a lot of
the out of position range construction. Yeah.
Right, and so basically it can tell us how we're going to play, right, because of how we've constructed range. So here, if we want to bet exactly 50% of the time, For example, say we want to bet exactly 50% of the time. It's queen, maybe queen. Yeah, so 53% of the time. It's close enough. Say we want to bet exactly 50% of the time. We can use the 50% rule to sort of construct a range. So say our range looks like this, right? So strong on the left and then weak on the right. Say that we're bluffing the bottom proportion and the top proportion, and the middle is just hands that we check, right? So here we're going to be bluffing sort of these hands, and then we're going to be value betting sort of these hands in the middle. We're just going to be checking them, right? So value betting these ones and then bluffing these ones, and then often the ratio between the two can tell us roughly what the bet size is. Or alternatively, if you have a bet size in mind, we can just figure out what the bluffs to value ratio is, and then draw our lines accordingly so that we're betting 50% of the time. And the way we calculate that exactly is just using solving the set of linear equations, the simultaneous equations, to do that. So it's relatively straightforward. So we have some, basically, so we're checking this middle 50%, right? And the blue to purple is the ratio of alpha for the size that we choose. That's if we choose one size. We could choose more than one size, and the solver does that reasonably well. Obviously, the bigger size is betting slightly more frequently. Sorry, the stronger hands are betting the bigger size more frequently. But basically, when the opposition player checks, you've got some bluffs here to use at the very, very bottom and the value at the very, very top. And so we can see which hands we want to use as a value bet simply by considering where it is in our range. So here, even middle pair 7-6 is bet. Probably not the best example. Maybe 10. Right, they check to us. We have some two pairs that we want to bet. Right, and some top pairs that we want to bet. Okay, so then we really just have to think when we're deciding whether to bet a hand or check a hand when our opponent has taken a line that looks like they're giving up. We just have to consider, is our hand in the very strongest, probably third of our range, or the bottom sort of 1/6 of our range, and that will give us a 50% checking range and a 50% betting range with a bluff to value ratio of 1 to 2. Mm-hmm. And so we have a pot size bet on average, right? Which is sort of what's happening here. So if we look at the percentages, that's probably not the best example. Let's go back to 7. Yeah, so here we've got roughly a pot size bet. Okay. And there is a 13%.
You can just look at the density. You can just look at the density of the blue at the bottom there. It's
so it's around 13% there, right? 30% bluffs, and then the remainder is 16 plus. Yeah, so whatever this is in terms of the value, and so you get roughly a 2-to-1 ratio between the value and the bluffs. So it's pretty straightforward, and the middling hands are checked, and that way we get a checking range, and the checking range here is 57% of the time, but often we want it to be 50% of the time exactly. Maybe if we run this like this. Yeah, it doesn't change much. Guess we can close that. Can help with this one. So we can have a look even some of the weird overbet spots, right? So here, overbet, call, check, and then the opposition player constructing their range, checks. And this is how the opposition player plays their hands. So here, check, and so with a 50% bet size, right? Here are all the value, and so the bluffs here are just selected sort of according to their blockers towards the bottom, mainly because all these hands are 0 checking EV. So It's not quite as nice, but you can see that the same sort of idea applies. Betting the strong hands when checked on the river, and then checking the weaker hands, and we're doing it roughly 50% of the time. When we're betting a little less than 50% of the time, and so that's how the 50% rule applies in these spots. So even 3-bet pots, it's going to apply. So 3-bet monotone. So yeah, checking back 50% of the time. This is on the flop, right, with roughly the same bet size for both players. That would make sense. Spots where it doesn't necessarily apply. So let's say we bet twice a pot and then they raise. It's very thin, very tiny range which is raised, and then the king, it calls, and then the king. And now when we have a checking range, here we're betting into it more than half the time. Right?
Is that because of the SPR? Or?
No. No. It's mainly got to do with the bet size.
Range advantage of...
Yeah, it's got to do with equity denial.
Mm-hmm.
So there's the checking range got quite a few weak hands, but all those weak hands actually have quite a good chunk of equity in terms of the ability to draw. And so the in-position players want to bet at a relatively high frequency despite that, just to deny the equity. So maybe we can have a look at this. So back onto the low rainbow flop, so we got the 875. And then we pot it, and then there's a raise, and then there's a call, and so we've got queen. Right, so we see on here that the out-of-position players wants to bet around half the pot with their betting range, but when they check, the in-position player wants to bet a quarter of the pot. And so that difference in the preferred bet size and sort of the ability to want to deny equity on this turn means that the 50% rule is not going to really apply as strongly on the turn. So the 50% rule doesn't apply quite as strongly on the flop and the turn, mainly because there's equity, and there's and when there's a lot of equity involved, one to deny equity, and blockers involved, one to sort of play with the ability to block parts of your opponent's range with parts of your range. But it's still going to apply on the river. So even if we go for the double check raise, it's probably not going to work because of the SPR. Right, but say bet call, and then it's a 9. Right, so it's still going to apply on the river. Right, so here the 9 is really good for the out-of-position player in a specific spot because you got a bunch of both and stuff now. So there's going to be quite a lot of donks, and when there isn't a donk, the in-position player is going to bet into it at a little bit less than 50% of the time. Okay, so let's have a look at a spot where it wouldn't apply. So let's say we've got this check raise, and here the pot is 121 and the stack is 39. So the SPR is like a third. It doesn't apply. When the SPR is very, very low, the out of position player should just be betting all their strong hands, all in basically. And so when they check, their range is very, very weak, and so you're just going to be betting into that with almost everything. Just because they can't or shouldn't really have too many strong hands in their checking range, because you have to bet very often. So when the SPR is less than 1, the 50% rule doesn't really apply, and you want to be betting more than half the time into your opponent on the river. And that way you make it such that their strongest hands have the same EV, roughly the same EV checking as they would betting. All right, so here's some straights. Jack 10 goes all in, the EV is the same because they either go all in and you call 77% of the time, or you check and then you go all in 74% of the time, right? So the same sort of idea. Roughly, the betting frequency is the same as the calling frequency when the SPR is less than 1. Any questions about that?
Nope.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
On the river, when in position, when the texture is such or the board run out is such that in position is at a disadvantage and really can't bet a 50% of the range, that means that's when the out of position will develop a leading range, because their checking is just going to result in a check. Am I on the right line there?
Yeah, exactly. So
Okay.
the 50% rule applies to the creation of donk bets as well. So donk bets are created when the turn or the river is really good for the out position player, and so the in position player just doesn't have the strength of the in position player relative to the out position player has gone down a lot, and so the out position player should be donking those turns,
Right,
in
basically,
accordance to the 50% rule, basically.
right, because the in-position player isn't going to bet for the out-of-position player because they just don't have the strength. Therefore, the EV comes from the leading.
Yes, and
Good.
so
Got it.
when you know that, right, you should have some donks, and against a strong player who does have donks in those spots, you should still be betting roughly 50% of the time. So here, if we look, if we pot it, and then we look at the turn reports, we can have a look at some donk betting. So here on the 8 is like the best card for the average player. But let's have a look at the let's just have a look at a 9. This might take a while to run. There's going to be donks for the out of position player. Right, so the out of position player is going to donk because their range has become so much stronger now, right, because of the specific turn card, in accordance with the 50% rule. Still, when they check, the in position player will bet 50% of the time, but the donks are created because of the additional strength that this turn card has brought to the out of position player. And if the out of position player instead had decided to check their entire range on this card, the in position player would, in response, check everything as well. Right, just because the out of position player is very strong. That might not necessarily be true, but there would be checking back a lot more. So here, 50% rule still applies. So you think that this 9 of clubs is just so good that you should check back everything, but that's not true because your opponent should have a donking range, and so you should still be betting into it almost half the time. Right. So say you had this 9-8-5, you bet the flop for pot size bet, and this 9 came, and then your opponent checks you on the turn. Like, it seems really scary, but your opponent showed weakness when they checked. They should have had a donking range, right? So you can still bet your strong hands, and the betting range becomes here you're betting only a little over 40% of the time, but the 50% rule shows that you should bet the in position player can't bet more than half the time anyway because the out position player has a donking range. So that was one of the consequences of the 50% rule. If the out position player has a betting range of some sort, when the out position player checks, the in position player should check back more than half the time.
So if they aren't donking correctly, then in position should just check back more often.
Yeah, if they're not donking as much as they should be, then the in position player should check back a lot. Right, but if they are donking quite a lot, when they do check, that does signal a lot of weakness, and so you can still be betting into it almost half the time, but not more than half the time. Any more questions about that?
No, that was good. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, what else have I covered? Yep, so we covered that. Yeah, we covered that. Yeah, I think we covered that. All right, I'll show you some weird spots, I think, where the 50% rule doesn't apply on the river. So let's have a look at 6. Sorry, this might take a while. But on certain runouts, when the chop is on the board, it won't apply on the river. And these spots are pretty rare. They're sort of useful to know how to play them, because the time that they do come up, it's important to know what you're doing. But you can't really use a 2% rule for them, so don't try. Yeah, so check, and the river is a 7. Yeah, so there you go. In-position players betting more than half the time into the out-of-position player, and that's because the chop's already on the board. There's a straight on the board already, and in order to have enough sort of bluffs, you need to be betting more than half the time actually in order to do it. So there's a pot size bet. That's a lot of folding. Jam. So yeah, that's one example where the 50% rule doesn't apply. So it's when the runout is a chop. That's when it doesn't apply on the river. But almost always when it applies on the river with the SPR being more than 1. Right? So if this wasn't a 7, this was like something else. Boom, we see the 50% rule applying there. Right? Or it was an 8. Still applies. 3 still applies, but really only the river cards that doesn't apply is going to be a 7 because of the chop on the board. Even the 7 of diamonds, right, with the flush doesn't apply because the chop's on the board. So what did we went through? So we went through some single raise pots and some 3-bet pots. Right, we talked about some situations where the 50% rule does apply, and a few situations where it doesn't apply. So you can see that the spots where it doesn't apply are actually much rarer than the spots where the 50% rule does apply. And so, like, sure, it's useful to know the spots where it doesn't apply, but even if you didn't know all those spots, following or sort of understanding that 50% rule will apply most of the time will still give you a pretty good estimate of what you should be doing, especially on the river, because it applies very strongly on the river. So maybe we can have a look at a 3-bet pot just for good measure. King Jack 8. Say, what's this half pot? Call 6. See if that solves. Right. Half pot. Call. It's a 2. And here the SPR is roughly 1. And so you can think that the 50% rule is going to apply, and you look at it and it does. Right. So here the SPR is roughly 1, the stack 62.5, and the pot 68, but for all intents and purposes, it's roughly 1 to 1. Maybe if there were more bet sizes for both players, you could find a checking range being slightly less than 50% of the time, but here it still applies. So in this line, which looks like a give up line, bet, check, right? You're betting into it roughly half of the time. So in order to figure that out, if say you didn't have the half pot bet size, if you only had a full pot all in, you would use the top 1/3 of your range for value, and then the bottom 1/6 of your range to bluff, and then the middle half is check back. On the other hand, if there was a bigger bet on the turn and then you called, here the SPR is only a half, and so it's not going to apply. You actually have to bet more frequently into the range of give-ups. So that might be a bit scary for a lot of people, right? So here you bet half the pot, call, you pot it, call, and now you check. Most people are just going to check back like top pair by default, right? They're just going to snap check back top pair because they're so scared of the line that you took on the previous street, right? But here it shows that you should be jamming into it at a relatively high frequency, more than half the time. So the top pair should just jam, and even some of these middle pairs, ace jack, should just jam.
It's because out of position would have just jammed his strongest hand.
Should have jammed himself because the SPR is only a half. Right, so when the SPR gets less than 1, when it gets pretty low, the 50% rule doesn't apply anymore, and you should be betting at relatively high frequency. Right here, if you went all in, you're calling 64% of the time, and so when you check, you should be roughly going in around 64% of the time. And if we run it out a bit to low DV, 63, 62.1, so roughly the same. So does that make sense for the differences about when it applies, when it doesn't apply? So when the SPR is less than 1, it's not going to apply. And so if you're on the river, when the SPR is less than 1, you should be betting very aggressively into the checking range because the opposition player should be going all in at a high frequency with all their strong hands. Maybe another example of that.
You say that like it's scary to do that, but I think also on the other side of the coin, when the out of position does check back after taking that line, and you bet into him, I think the scare factor is probably equally as relevant for the out of position as well after he checks.
I mean, it kind of looks like a give up line, right, for him.
Yeah. So the point is, a lot of the time. So where was it? Yeah. A lot of the time when they're checking, they're giving up, and so when they check, you're just happy to see showdown with your king 9, right? So you're just very happy to see showdown. But what this rule, what we're saying is that because of 50% rule, the SPR is less than 1, you should just go all in. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So imagine you're the cutoff here. You've got king 9 suited, or king 10 suited, or whatever. Your opponent 3 bets. You're going to see this flop of king jack 8. Your opponent bets half pot on the flop, pots on the turn, and then checks the river with this run out. It's just very comfortable to check back, right, and see showdown. Hopefully they were bluffing. But what we looked at just so far with the 50% rule and the counter example to the 50% rule is showing that you should be betting it at a high frequency because the SPR is low.
Yep.
And Thomas, when the in position shoves, what's the equity of the calling range that out of position has? Oh wow. Yeah. 52%.
Still has some hands that can call. Very few.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it also shows that if you're the opposition player and you know that your opponent is just always going to check back. So say you've made this play and you're on the river with the SPR of only a half. If you know that your opponent isn't going to be betting anywhere near as often as they should be, then you should just go all in with all of your strong hands and have a very weak checking range.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe another example when the SPR becomes low, like this here, the pot is 90 and the stack is 55. The check, and then you're going all in more than half the time. Right. So here we've got a pair of 8s. Yeah. So probably the best example because that's not raised very often. Maybe on a paired board. Let's look at a paired board. So this paired flop maybe. check raise call. Hopefully that won't take too long. So it's really just looking at the difference between when the SPR is less than 1 on the river and the SPR is more than 1 on the river. When the SPR is more than 1 on the river, the 50% rule applies. So when your opponent checks, you're betting into it half the time, or a little bit less than half the time. But when the SPR is less than 1, you're betting it into it very frequently at roughly what the minimum difference frequency is for the all-in.
What happens when the river, you know your opponent is always giving up when he checks?
If you know that your opponent is always
100%
giving
of their
up, yeah, you
bluffs.
should always bet.
Because they'll just always fold.
Yeah, if their range is entirely give ups, then you should always bet. Essentially, because you always win the pot. There's just no strong hand in it.
Yep.
So that's one of the other exploits. So yeah, here we're check raise on the flop and then pots on the turn. Then here we have a SPR of 2. And so when there's a check, here there is a betting roughly half the time, right? The whole reason why it's betting a little bit more is probably because there's not enough bet sizes to fully, because the 50% rule really only applies to true no limit, all right? So we're looking at these sims. There's going to be some sizes that aren't in the sim that would be used in GTO land, like actual GTO. And so you can see some abnormalities in here. So here's a checking frequency of only 47% when you're expecting it to be a little bit above 50 because of the 50% rule. But that could just be because instead of a pot size bet, it wants to use a slightly smaller or slightly bigger bet, and vice versa for the other person. Sorry, half pot bet. Maybe all I want to use a slightly smaller one, or a slightly bigger one. So bets, and then right, you see this is sort of a give up line, and it's just a shove. That's interesting why it uses 7-6, but yeah, that's what it looks like. And then there's the all-in itself, or a pot size bet. So here on the turn, 50% rule. So I've got the check raise, checks, betting roughly half the time. We see that the out position player and the in position player are betting roughly the same sizes. So that makes some sense there. All right. So yeah, you guys wanted to talk about a bit about exploits. So let's have a look. So with what we've just talked about, what exploits do you think you can come up with? Do you think we can come up with using the 50% rule? So one we talked about was if your opponent bets too often when you check, right? The way to exploit that is to basically bet all of your weak hands and then check all of your strong hands, right? And then try and check raise, right? Unless you know that your opponent is also going to overfold to the check raise, then you can check raise some bluffs. But otherwise, you should just be betting your weak hands because they're not going to be able to see the river as effectively if they checked. Okay, another one is that if your opponent is taking a give up line, right, but you know that they never protect that give up line, you should ignore the 50% rule and always bet into it. Right. Another one is when the sack pot ratio gets pretty low, right, and you're and you've barreled off, and then the sack pot ratio has become very low, and you know that your opponent isn't going to bet into you enough of the time, then you should just bet all of your strong hands. Right. So it's the exact opposite. So That's even true if the SPR is more than one. If your opponent isn't betting into you often enough, say on the river, they're not going to be betting into, say you've double barreled, right, and you're considering whether you should check or bet your strong hand, right? If you think the opponent isn't going to be betting roughly 50% of the time when you check, and they're going to be checking back almost all the time, you should basically always bet your strong hands instead, because your check raise isn't going to be anywhere near as effective. All right, anyone else, any other exploits anyone can think of? Or any other questions to do with 50% rule and trying to exploit your opponents using it? Great. Any questions about any of these sims that we've looked at?
I guess some of these sims, Thomas, you said are newish, or they're not yet in the library.
This one is. This one. This is the overbet flops. So I'm going to use this for the overbet tutorial probably next week.
Oh, okay.
How do you run it to 0 EV? So you just press this button, and that runs it to 0 EV on GTO Plus. So you want to look at this particular river, and you want it to run it to 0 EV. Just press that, and then eventually goes to 0 EV. So it's pretty quick on the river, but then on the flop, it's going to take a bit longer to run the turn to 0 EV.
What does it mean by DEV? Like difference in EV between the players?
Yeah, that's the difference in EV from the solution that it has currently to GTO. And so if you run it to 0, whatever the flop ranges were, right? The flop ranges are all set in, basically set in stone, and then you have the turn run a very low EV. And you can get slight differences, right? So here, like the 0.02% checking, so betting range will probably disappear if you run it to 0 EV. Right, that's what it looks like. And you've got the river. Right, so when you're looking at sims and you see something weird as in it doesn't apply a 50% rule, it's probably on the river. It's probably because either your stack to pot ratio is less than 1, or more likely is that your sim isn't big enough, right? You don't have enough bet sizes in it in order for it to fully see what's going on. And even some of my sims, which are very large, fall victim to that sometimes. So here, the smallest bet size I've got is half pot, but maybe something like 40% pot might be better. And so that would get the betting frequency up to 50%. If Villain's supposed to check range, but he bets, does that mean we should overfold? No. So here we can have a look at some spots. Say these paired boards. Right, on ace, king, king. Here, obviously, it makes no sense for villain to bet, but say they bet half pot, you should still be folding roughly at alpha. So here, alpha is a third. I guess half pot bet, you're folding 31%, so that's close. All right, so if they're taking like a weird line that's just totally out of GTO, you should still be falling back on your core principles, right? You know, against most bets, you should be falling roughly at alpha, and so you should be doing that here. So obviously you can't overfold, because if you did overfold, then your opponent's bluffs, right? So you just want to bluff 7-3 or 7-2. They could do that profitably if you overfolded. All right, so here there's a small donking range on this river. So it's ace 2-2. There's a small donking range on the flop, right? And because of that, 50% rule is sort of being applied here. Checks back more than half the time. The turn checks through. So here you're betting 4 times a pot with the value, but turn checks through. Again, 50% rule applying roughly. Right. The difference here is that here the opposition player is betting 4 times a pot, and versus the opposition player is only betting a quarter of the pot. So that sort of explains why the 50% ball is a bit bent there. And so it goes check, check. Once again, 50% rule applies. Here they're checking a third time, so check 3 times into us, and then we're betting half the time. Top part of our range for value in the bottom part of our range as a bluff in the middle, 50% is being checked. So look at the percentages that are being bet as a bluff. Here that's roughly 15-ish%, 14%, something like that. And so then you expect the value to be 36%. And then the ratio between those two is roughly the bet size on average that they've used.
What is a good exploit if the person probes too often on the turn? Like you see, he's still supposed to check like 88%.
Yeah. So here, if they're probing too often on the turn, when they check, you can ignore the 50% rule and bet more often. So that's another exploit. If they're betting too often, right here you see they're betting, they should be checking 88% of the time to prevent you from betting a lot. But if they're just betting like 40% of the time into you on this turn,
yeah, like let's say they bet every ace on the turn.
Yeah. So say they did that, which is a very silly thing to do. If they did that, then when they check, you should basically bet everything.
So we should value bet all our pairs and all our aces.
Yeah, you could even bet your entire range, to be honest. And you'll find that a lot, especially the weaker players. They don't understand that they should be protecting their checking range, and so when they check the second time, they're very, very weak. And so you can ignore the 50% rule against them and bet all the time. But that sort of assumes that you played it correctly on the flop, and you've checked back more than half the time because of the 50% rule in a specific spot, because they have a knocking range, because they have so many twos. Right? So it's a bit of a so say here, for example, on like Jack 6-3, if it does go, no, it doesn't. That's not going to check back. Jack 6-3 rainbow, Jack 7-4. If it does go check check, right, and then like the turn is like a brick, like a 2. If you look at the turn reports, here on the ace, right? So say it goes check check and the turn is an ace, and your opponent like doesn't care that the turn is an ace, and they're just betting at a very high frequency. That just means that their checking range is much weaker than it should be, and because it's much weaker than it should be, you can know that they haven't followed the 50% rule, right? And so you, as the in-position player, can bet into it more than half the time. Right, so the 50% rule really applies to the opposition player most strongly, because they should be constructing their checking range to prevent you from betting more than half the time. But if they're not following that, then you don't have to follow it either as the exploit, right? But if they are following it, then you should be following its consequences, in that you should be checking back more than half the time.
That's why the delayed c-bet is so successful in the stakes that I play, I think. Yes.
When you're playing relatively low stakes, your opponents aren't going to protect their double check range, the range that they've checked twice or 3 times. It's not going to be protected, and often you can be very successful at betting into that range with at a very high frequency. You don't have to really follow the 50% rule in those spots, because your opponent's checking range is just very weak. they haven't followed the 50% rule by trying to protect their range, and so you shouldn't follow it by trying to check back.
Yep. Yeah, the delayed c-bet is ridiculously successful in like an L10.
Yeah, if you're finding it very successful, then you can sort of construct your game a little bit around exploiting that weakness that you found.
Mm.
Right? So then you can do stuff like checking back more often where you would have bluffed, and then hope your opponent checks a second time, and then use that as an opportunity to bluff because you see it's very successful.
Yep.
So then you haven't like risked anything on the flop, and
Yep.
then you've waited for a profitable spot, and then you've taken advantage of that profitable spot, which is exactly the kind of exploits which you should be doing when you're playing poker against weaker opposition. You should be looking for specific weaknesses in their game. Here you notice one that if they've checked a second time on the turn, right, they're almost always giving up. So that means that you can always bet into them and then win the pot because they just given up. So you should try to construct your game to try and exploit that spot as often as you can.
Yep.
Right?
Hey, Thomas, can we just see that ace of clubs turn and see how the out of position constructs his checking range? I'm just curious.
When it goes check, check.
And it comes eight of club turn, yeah.
Ace of clubs. All
Ace
right.
of clubs, yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's going to take a while to run.
Oh, yeah.
We can talk in the meantime. Yeah, do you guys have any other questions?
Yeah, I'm just expecting here that the out of position is going to have some traps in their checking range. I mean, the ace is, obviously really good for in position. So I think, in game, I would be tempted to put in a large bet to try to get some value out of an ace, but I guess you got to balance it with a strong checking range.
The out of position player. Yeah, the out of position player. I think I've made. Yeah, there's a 4x pot bet on the turn, and so that should be used with like trips and stuff.
Right.
And that's why the checking range is going to be like 8%. So the betting range is only going to be like 8%.
Yeah.
It's a thing with a nut advantage, but your turn improves your opponent, so you just overbet your nuts.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Exactly, and put the race in a really difficult spot.
And so the 50% rule still applies. The checking range has a bunch of ace X, as well as probably a few sets very rarely that would check raise. But because on this ace your opponent is going to be betting so often, or should be betting so often, you can be checking a lot. And that's probably another exploit, right? When it goes check check on the flop and the ace comes, right? If you know that your opponent is going to be betting this ace a lot, right, more than half the time after you checked, you should check a set instead of betting 4 times a pot. Right? So like GTO, you're betting 4 times a pot with a set. Right? But the main reason why people don't do that is because your opponent is going to be betting into you more often than half the time.
Right.
Right? Because they're not following the 50% rule. And so you exploit that by putting your sets into the checking range. It still doesn't mean that you can't bet 4 times a pot as a bluff. I mean, you can probably do that.
Right. So I guess we'll probably see that when out of position checks on the turn, in position would be checking back probably some of his aces, wouldn't he? Or some of his
a
strong.
lot of them. And then those aces could raise a small bet on the river type thing.
Right.
Or bet on the river when checked too.
Yeah. It's an interesting spot because in position you would be tempted to bet that ace because you don't want to really miss value, but against a strong opponent you got to protect your you don't want to bet that often.
Yeah, and there's probably another thing, the 50% rule is that if you know that your opponent has bet too often in position on the turn, then on the next street you can just go ham. You can like overbet the next street a lot, right? Because their checking range is much weaker than it should be.
Right, as an exploit.
Yes. So the 50% rule, like, so you can see that once you understand how it applies and why it applies, then you've come up with all these different exploits that you can try and implement, and it helps you sort of analyze a hand much easier, right? It's a lot quicker for you to sort of see whether you're playing the hand well or not now because you know the 50% rule, right? You know that when your opponent has made a big bet on the previous street, now given up, right? Second sort of a give up line, you should still be betting into it rather than checking back, right? Even though it might be scary to be betting into a polar range, you still have to do it because you still want to get that value against some of your opponent's sort of middling hands, which overbet the turn and then check the river or something like that. And also if you, it's another exploit, if you know that your opponent isn't going to be betting into you when you've done something weird like betting 4 times a pot on the turn and then checking the river, right? If your opponent isn't going to be betting into you like that, then you could start doing that for thinner value. So here we're going to see this complete. And so we're probably going to see some 2x and 4x pot bets on this turn ace. And then we can explore that quickly and then have a look at how the opponent reacts to betting 4 times a pot on the turn and then checking the river.
Be curious to see what flush draws are bet 4x the pot.
Maybe the combo ones.
Yeah, whether it be the ace high. Well, it wouldn't be the ace high. Well, I don't know. I mean, maybe the lower, the lower ones. I don't know.
Okay. So yeah, there we go. 90% checking range, 10% betting range, 4 times a pot. So let's have a look at what happens when we bet 4 times a pot. This is what it looks like. There. This is the value. It's kind of interesting, I guess. There's a 25-ish% like trips and 2 pairs, and then the rest is bluffs. Which kind of makes sense in betting 4 times a pot. What your bluff to value ratio is going to be. Like this 3-to-1-ish because you got a bunch of equity as well. So yeah, bluffing a lot.
So none of the draws are bet like that, are they?
Yeah, plenty of draws. Flush draws here.
Oh yeah. Sorry, the green put me off. Okay, yeah.
And just got shots, stuff like that. So betting 4 times a pot, call. Let's say the turn is a brick, and then it checks. right? So 50% rule. So you're still going to be betting into it roughly half the time. Yeah, let's new setup. Yeah. So if you yeah, so there you got it. There you go. You got a bluff to value ratio. You got some top pairs and then some bluffs there.
So this is like betting into a polar range.
Yeah, yeah. So betting into the polar range. So you're still doing it roughly half the time. Yeah, because you're still going to get called by worse. So like, yeah, top pair is still a value bet because they're just going to be shoving twice the pot a lot. And so when they check, you're going to be betting into it. Get some value from whatever weak pairs that were checked and now call sometimes. What's that, 3-2? It's a pair of twos man on the river, pair of twos man on the river. Right, pair of twos man on the river. Like some ace queen. A little bit there, which always calls, obviously. Right, so it's going to be pretty scary if you're like that. You've they bet 4 times a pot into you on the turn, and you've got like ace 5 or something, right? That's just like a regular top pair, but that's always betting.
Yeah.
So it's pretty scary if you were doing that. And so if you know that your opponent isn't doing that, and they're not going to be bluffing, or they're going to be overfolding these, or maybe they're only bluffing all their air and not value betting the top pairs and stuff as thin, and they do make this bet. That means that you can probably bluff even more on previous street for 4 times a pot, because when you do make a pair, you can just check it and then win it showdown against some of their air and weaker pairs and stuff like that. Because they're not taking the value, they're not trying to get value with their top pair anymore.
Calling 28% of the time versus a 4x.
Yeah, so if you bet 4 times a pot, right, alpha is what is it, 80%?
80%, yeah.
So you should be falling around 80%, so that's correct. Yeah, does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Is that min raise thing just an anomaly? Like if you run it more,
no,
it probably.
That's correct.
Yeah, I've seen that in position, like in your flop overbet tutorial. Thomas, I saw out of position raising against overbets, which I wouldn't have expected to see, but I guess you can raise an overbet.
Yeah, so we have a look at the raising range. It's like trips 2 pair, some top pair, right? It's a lot of top pair. So like, is raising these top pairs as a bluff? Yeah, because they're trying to rep trips, essentially, against overbet. Yeah, so you can just rejam, I guess. That's the top pair. The top pair is calling this ace king. What is jamming? Yeah, 2 pair plus and flush draws. And some open enders. Yep. So it's 4 times a pot, 2 times a pot. Same sort of idea. Betting into it quite frequently. Right, so you're betting into this polar range quite frequently. It would seem scary after you face a 2x pot bet. But sort of they have to with ace king, ace queen. Right, and then if they're not, that means they're either over bluffing, right, with all their air, which they would have had that floated your 2x pot bet on the turn. Which means that you can call all of your pairs essentially, which seems a bit ridiculous, but it is true. That if your opponent isn't value betting these top pairs after you bet twice a pot into them, right? You can check these weak pairs and then call when they bet, because when they do bet, they're over bluffing because of all the floats that they had. Right, the bluff to value ratio is wrong, and so you profitably call. So yeah, when your opponent does take a very polar line on the turn and then check the river, you should still be betting into the range at a relatively high frequency, around 50%.
And with that SPR, that's largely a bet fold, isn't it? I mean, with some of your top pair hands, I would think.
Yeah, so the top pairs are all indifferent here.
All right.
These are the two pairs are indifferent. Just a jam. Yeah, and so check, and then now even the ace like looks really good. Like suddenly they have like almost 30% top pairs in their range compared to you, which only had 12.9%. Right? They're still only betting 40% of the time. Right, because of the idea that you can just check raise.
And what, it's a half pot size roughly?
This is pot sized, yeah.
Pot size, right?
So obviously, if you're not betting very often, then you should be betting a bit bigger. Right, which is exactly what's happening here. So potting it,
right,
and it's a call, and then check and half pot, cool. But there's quite a bit of overfolding, and that makes sense because there's just so much air from pre-flop on this flop. So say just check. Right, check again. All right, 50% rule sort of applies there. Bet half pot, folding 61% of the time against a half pot bet, and the reason is there's so much air in the checking range, and it's okay for you to have air, right, as long as that air is protected by a few strong hands that go for the check raise. Right, but if you don't have the strong hands, then you can't just check. You can't have your checking range only be air because your opponent will bet their entire range into you. Right, so it's got to be a good mix. So here, there's some two pairs and some sets and some straights which check. Mainly straights and mainly sets and two pairs which check, and then when they face a bet, they go for the check raise. Another thing here is that my tree isn't very big. There isn't an extra size, so there could be a 2x pot raise, something like that, above this, which could be used, and that would bring the checking frequency up to around 50%. Right, so a lot of the times when you see an anomaly in the 50% rule, it's probably because the sim isn't big enough. So this is one of the examples of where the sim isn't big enough. Here they're checking only 48.4% of the time when they should be checking around 50% of the time. And the reason is because here this bet size here doesn't have a bigger raise size associated with it versus this one. It has the all-in, which can be used some of the time. But there should be some bigger raise sizes. And that would make it less profitable to bet that size. And so you would have checking frequency closer to 50%. Although it is still pretty close to 50%. So you check, bet 4 times a pot. Right, pretty standard. All right, so yeah, we've talked about a lot of stuff. Just gone through and sort of used the 50% rule to help us sort of dissect the nature of the game. And hopefully you guys will be able to know what I'm talking about now when I say the 50% rule. And hopefully you guys can sort of think about how you're going to apply it in your game when you're going to try and obey it, when you think that your opponent is breaking because the 50% rule is roughly a rule of thumb. when your opponent is sort of breaking that, and how you're going to exploit them because they're breaking that. Right, so if they break the 50% rule in some spot, right, either they're in position or out of position, how are you going to exploit that? How are you going to change your game to exploit that weakness in their game? Right, so you should be thinking about this. Right, so one of the examples that we talked about was when they've checked twice, the second or third checking range just isn't predicted at all, and so you should bet into it at a very high frequency. All right, so any last questions about the 50% rule and the tutorial we just did?
None for me. That was good.
How did you come up with this principle? Just from analyzing sims?
Yeah, so maybe if you go back into the group and like go back. When did I come up with it? Yeah, so here, this conjecture. So the 50% rule was created on the 5th of December 2018, essentially. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was looking at a bunch of different sims. Actually, there was one I made before this that was just looking at the checking range, and I added the bets or raises because of the idea that you could have a betting range that was very weak and a checking range that was very strong. And so, like, yeah, that's the conjecture. So it was made roughly on the 4th of December of 2018. And that was looking at a bunch of sims, and then a few. There's a toy game. There's a toy game essentially where you've got like the out of position player, right? That's a horrible color. The out of position player has the ace and the queen, and the in position player has the king and the jack, right? And say the out of position player only has this like 10% of the time, and the in position player has 90% of the time, and this is 50-50 roughly, right? So it's 50-50. Then you can have a look at the different SBRs. There might not be 10%, it could be 20% or 30% as well. The different SBRs, how often is the out of position player checking the ace, right, and going for the check raise all in, right? And what size is the in position player betting? Yeah.
Yeah.
And so the solution of this game is that the in position player will basically, almost regardless of what these numbers are, check 50% of the time if the SBR is more than one, and there's enough ace in the out of position player's range. If it's only like 1% ace, then it could be the case the in position bets more than half the time because they're betting all of their king for value.
Yeah.
But if there's enough ace to prevent the in position player from betting all of their king all the time, right, then the in position player will bet on average 50% of the time for whatever the optimal size is based on the out of position player's range. Right, so the out of position player will jam some of the aces as well as the king, as well as the queen for a bluff, or check some of the aces and go for the check raise all in. Yeah, and so the solution of this game is that in position bets exactly 50% of the time. So this is what's happening on the river, and so it's why the 50% rule is so strong on the river. This is essentially what's happening.
I think you've got that toy game in your in one of the modules, Thomas, if I remember right, in one of the game theory modules.
No, I looked at a limit version of it, not a no limit.
Oh, limit version.
Okay.
Yeah, this is a no limit. So I'll probably have it in my book. Well, I'll definitely have it in my book, to be honest.
Cool.
All right, so yeah, that's the basis of it. Looking at a bunch of sims, and then as well as that toy game.
Nice.
All right, yeah, and so yeah, 50% rule is it's a Zenith Poker exclusive. You're gonna find out about it anywhere else. I don't think. All right, any other questions?
Nope, that was very good, Thomas. Thank you.
That was awesome. What I like about it is it's not a simplification of strategy, but it's not a simplification, but it's an ease of thought process. It helps the decision process. It makes it somewhat easier. You know, when you're playing games like excuse me, like Zoom or even multiple tables, anything that can take some of the weight off the mental exercise, I think, is super beneficial. I really enjoyed this. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. So yeah, try and in terms of like the thought process, like try and implement it into your thought process. Like think about, does this spot make sense for the 50% rule, right? Does the 50% rule apply to this spot? Yes or no? Like how would it apply? What exploit can I come up with because of it, right? And it makes a lot of difficult decisions very, very easy once you know it. Like, so when your opponent is taking a very polar line against you and then they've checked, like you're still actually betting into them, despite that they've been very polar up until now.
Yep. Thank you. Very good module and tutorial.
Yep. Hope you guys have fun. Anyone's listening at home, thanks for listening. I'll turn the recording off now.